Paper 3, Child Psychology, requires you to be able to describe and evaluate the observational research method. You need to be able to distinguish between structured and naturalistic observations. The mark schemes make it apparent that there are several key differences that they need you to be aware of. I hope this PowerPoint helps you to do so. How might a researcher conduct a structured observation? First of all, they'll need to work out a list of predetermined behaviours that they're expecting to see and can use to create a tally. This is known as the observation schedule. A structured observation also typically uses a controlled environment that's been set up in order that the expected behaviours are more likely. Sometimes this environment will include a one-way mirror, which means that observers cannot be seen. Usually speaking, the participants will have given their fully informed consent, so it's not a covert observation necessarily, but the researcher will not distract the baby or toddler, and this of course preserves the validity of the observation, but we'll come to evaluation later. When researchers are not interacting with the participants, it's called a non-participant observation. Maybe they'll use a video camera so that the episode can be watched again, potentially by another researcher, in order to check for reliability of the data. There are several methods by which the researcher may record what they see. First of all, event sampling, which means they'll write down every example of the predetermined behaviours from their observation schedule. This can be tricky though, so sometimes they'll use point sampling. This means writing down the behaviour that a child is showing at predetermined points, for example every 10th minute in a 2-hour observation. Time sampling is another way of collecting data. In this method, they'll write down the behaviours that are seen within a predetermined amount of time, for example, everything that they see in a full 5 minutes every half an hour. Researchers will probably conduct a pilot study before their main data collection to check that the observation schedule and other elements of the procedure are working as required before completing the main data collection. Once the data has been collected, the researcher can add up all the tallies from their observation schedule and see which behaviours were most commonly occurring, the modal categories, or they may look at all of the different behaviours shown by a child and use these to make some sort of classification. This is like Ainsworth did in the Estranged Situation, where she looked at the amount of protest at separation, the degree of stranger fear, whether the child was happy to play alone in the room and use the mother as a safe base, for example. She looked at all of these different behaviours and made an assessment of the child, putting them into the categories of anxious avoidant, anxious resistant, securely attached, etc. So, why might a researcher choose to use a structured observation as opposed to an unstructured observation? Well, the well-defined, predetermined categories in the observation schedule mean that the data collected is more reliable. Researchers will therefore be more objective in the data that they've collected. Also, using a standardised setup in the room and of the toys, etc., and the procedure mean it's possible to replicate the data collection, which strengthens the reliability. Also, structured observations collect quantitative data that can be analysed easily, turned into statistics and graphs, and possibly used to see trends easily and make comparisons, for example, between different age groups or different cultures. If you're going to be discussing structured observations in your exam, it's very likely that the question will ask you to relate to children's behaviour. You should always use examples to help extend your descriptive work. The best example for this topic would be Ainsworth's Strange Situation. Make sure that when you go back through this PowerPoint, you can see how all the points made in the description section could be elaborated with ideas from Ainsworth's Strange Situation. So, an evaluation of the structured observation. For this exam, you should be able to evaluate with regard to strengths and weaknesses in the key areas of reliability, validity and ethics. So a structured observation can be very good when it comes to reliability. The standardised procedure means that every participant experiences the exact same circumstances, and this means the study can be replicated and the results checked for reliability. Also, you can use more than one observer to check for inter-rater reliability, and the researchers can be trained really carefully using pilot clips in order to make proper use of the observation schedule and collect reliable data. Ethics can also be very good. Participants are likely to have given fully informed consent and had a standardised procedure and observation schedule explained to them in detail. They'll also know of their right to withdraw, and researchers will be carefully watching them and intervene should infants get overly distressed, as in the strange situation where this is known to have happened. Validity can also be good in a structured observation, despite what some people might tell you. If researchers conduct detailed naturalistic observations with a variety of children and parents before creating their schedule, they'll be better informed about the range and intensity of behaviours that they might see, and this will help them to create an observation schedule which reflects the greater range of behaviours, meaning that it is more useful and more meaningful. Also, researchers may create set-up situations, but in a more natural setting, such as a quiet room in the child's own nursery, and this will ensure that the child is behaving more naturally, improving the overall meaningfulness and validity of the day. But there are some weaknesses, and it's important that you can balance your strengths with weaknesses. So, validity can be a weakness. A poorly designed observation schedule may collect quantitative data in categories which are too narrow, rigid, or inflexible to provide meaningful data. When situations have been deliberately set up, then this is not a natural setting, and children and parents may not behave in similar ways as they would in their own homes or nurseries, for example. When people know that they're being observed, this can also create what's known as the Hawthorne effect, where their behaviour changes in line with demand characteristics and social desirability. Don't forget, when you're using key bits of jargon like this, then you ought to explain them, but for the sake of creating this PowerPoint, I've just left them as they are. Also, researchers may be biased if they know that the hypothesis of the study, and this means that they may be subjective and interpret the behaviours that they see differently to a person with different expectations. They may also interact differently with the participants, bringing about demand characteristics. So, now to turn to the naturalistic observation. Unlike a structured observation, naturalistic observations typically take place in a real-world environment such as the child's own home, nursery or school. There's nothing set up or contrived. The behaviour of the child and parent is spontaneous, arising as a consequence of the naturally occurring variations in the setting and not in response to something set up by the researcher. Given that the setting is natural, it's unlikely that you'll be able to use a one-way mirror. However, it may be possible to set up a video camera, and this can be made more or less obvious to the participant as the researcher desires. This will depend on the ethics. Naturalistic observations can also be participant or non-participant, so if you need to write quite a detailed description of naturalistic observation, you may want to mention the different types: covert, overt, participant, non-participant, but of course don't forget, if you use extra bits of terminology, then you will need to elaborate them. Observers then may use a list of predetermined behaviours that they're expecting to see and can use to create a tally. The observation schedule as in a structured observation, but in a real-world setting with no interference from the researchers. The observers may collect qualitative data if they wish by simply making written notes about what they see or by talking into a dictaphone or MP3 player. So, if you're aiming to describe the naturalistic observation, the best way to get yourself some points for elaboration would be to use a research example. The one that I've given you some notes on is a study by Maluish, which was conducted in the real-world setting of a nursery. Also, if you wanted to, you could mention the Robertsons film clips that were taken in the 1950s in the various different hospitals of the children such as John and Jane and Lucy and Kate and all of those others. There are also aspects of the Genie case study that are naturalistic, and I've given a few examples here. In the film that we watched, there are many examples of Susan Curtis talking about, for example, observations that she made when shopping in Woolworths for the different coloured threads. She tells a story of her observations of a butcher who gave Jeanie meat which she would smell like a dog. There's also the telling of a story about a little boy. I think it was James Kent that told this story, where the little boy passed Jeanie in the street and handed her his fire engine. So any of these could be used as examples of naturalistic observation of spontaneously occurring behaviour as well. You also might wish to bring in Ainsworth's more naturalistic observations that she made in Uganda, where she used what's called a more emic approach. In the EMIC approach, she used things like participant observation and interviews together to collect more qualitative style data within the cultural context and not impose her own expectations when observing the children. Another really good example that you could use, which is an interesting one because it does take place in a more real world setting, but is also slightly contrived as well, is Schaffer and Emerson's ways of collecting data with regard to separation anxiety, where they look at the children's behaviour in their own homes, in their gardens, outside shops, etc. He also measured stranger fear, but within the child's own home, when the researcher approached the baby at home rather than in the strange situation, which was a laboratory setting. So, evaluating the naturalistic observation. The reliability then. If the researcher does use a well-designed and tightly operationalised observation schedule, like in a structured observation, and trains the observers sufficiently beforehand using a pilot study, then the data may well be reliable. It would, however, be fairly impossible to check whether the data was indeed reliable, as the naturalistic setting means that there's no standardised procedure and no control, so the study can't be replicated to actually check for that reliability. The use of a video camera, however, would mean that the data could be checked by another researcher, and this could be a way of replicating and testing for reliability. With regard to validity then, the ecological validity of the naturalistic observation should be really good, with regard to the spontaneity of the observed behaviour and lack of contrived setup, which brings about more natural behaviour. The validity may still be poor, however, if a poorly designed observation schedule with narrow, rigid categories is used, meaning the richness of behaviour is lost as behaviours are forced into one-size-fits-all categories. Also, participant observations, which can be a form of naturalistic observation, can be excellent in accessing data, which can be improved through the relationships forged when the researcher becomes accepted into the group. However, objectivity can be lost, and this reduces validity. So, the last couple of different types of observation are covert and overt. So, when naturalistic observations are conducted in a covert manner, this is useful as it can avoid observer effects, i.e., participants changing their behaviour because they know they're being watched. However, this obviously leads to ethical issues as well. Overt naturalistic observations do, of course, suffer from observer effects, but their added bonus is, of course, that they are completely ethical because the participants know they're being watched. So, as we've just mentioned some ethics, let's get stuck into the last section. The BPS guidelines state that it is okay to make observations in public places, so a lack of informed consent may not be seen as a problem. However, this does mean that people do not have the right to withdraw or to receive debriefing, which could cause later psychological harm unless confidentiality is maintained. Now, with regards to the fact we're doing child psychology, and I haven't put this on this slide, of course I should mention, as I would with every research method, that if you're using children that are under the age of 16, you must gain parental consent, even if the parents aren't actually present. So, for example, if you're going into a school to observe the children, even if you'd ask for the children for consent, which you should always do, you must get the permission of the parents as well, and have explained in full detail what the observation is for, how the data will be used, and explain to them that the data will be destroyed when the project is finished. And I hope this presentation has helped you to get to grips with the difference between naturalistic observation and structured observation. A structured observation uses an observation schedule and collects quantitative data, and it's usually done in a setting which has been controlled in some way and quite often set up to elicit certain behaviours. This is different to a naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observations only record spontaneous behaviour where the researcher has had no control over the setting. Also, it should be noted, however, that the naturalistic observation can collect quantitative data using an observation schedule, but it can also collect qualitative data. That said, of course, a structured observation might also collect qualitative data too. And I really do hope this has been useful to you. I know it's a little bit confusing, and some of the confusion is mainly due to Edexcel and their own way of answering some of the questions, but I'm sure that this will have helped, and I wish you every success in your answering of the questions.